Hey everyone, welcome to week 3 and not being in class in person. So here's just one of the videos related to one of the sets of slides from this week's materials related to public health communication. So the particular topics of this week are to talk about communication strategies. And then in the next set of slides and video, we'll talk a little bit about social dimensions of health, and then we'll tie those couple things together. So the first thing for us to consider, and we've actually talked about this already a little bit in class, and this has been some of the questions from your prompts too, about how do you personally make health decisions? So some of you have already had to think about this. What information sources do you use? So last week we talked about evidence, where evidence comes from, very briefly. I mean, even though it felt like maybe I talked for a while. Honestly, we scratched the surface of evidence and who makes evidence, who gets to create it, who gets to classify it as evidence, who deems it as credible. We discussed very briefly in class, whether or not when you get a piece of health information, you check it out with other sources, you read the citations, you look for the citations, you understand what that means to read them. And that's also really complicated stuff. So it's not that if you're not doing those things that you've somehow missed the boat, but that you haven't necessarily been educated that way. Some of you may have received that education from other degrees, other professions. Maybe you went to a secondary school that actually provided that level of discernment related to health information. But most people, when health information that is put out beyond the academic sphere is disseminated, is written for an 8th grade education. So consider that most of the education you've received, even related to health information in your high school years and possibly even your collegiate years or beyond, hasn't necessarily gone beyond that level. And it's meant specifically for the level of writing and the level of cognitive understanding or input, but also the data points themselves. So just think about that when you think about what information you're using. And then we think about, well, what data do we collect, right? That's, a question of what data do you collect personally? And then what data do we collect? And we talked a little bit about that last time. Who do we even study? Well, we study people that we think are high risk. Why do we think they're high risk? This ties a lot into what we're talking about in terms of social dimensions of health. It's the people that are high risk and worth studying and have revealed themselves as data points, right, or sort of walking health disasters, are also people that we have cultivated as a society to have risk factors. So what's very fascinating is that when we study an at-risk population, say women of color who are experiencing higher rates of mortality, morbidity, we have to also consider that there are a lot of social dimensions of health that contribute to that. But the reason that they're a risk factor is not simply because of the color of their skin or that they are female-born people, although typically speaking, I mean, if you're talking about anything related to perinatal, it's going to involve a uterus. But it's not simply the fact that they are pregnant and dark-skinned that they are automatically at risk for preeclampsia and higher rates of hemorrhage, higher rates of infection, and higher rates of death. There are other contributions. And so when we talk about what data do we collect, when we talk about public health messaging, one of the things to ask is, what are they not asking? And very often what we are not asking and what could really impact how we make health decisions is, well, what else is a factor here? Is it simply that being of darker skin makes you more likely to die in pregnancy? No, not necessarily. There are things like implicit bias and racism in healthcare, by healthcare providers, by healthcare systems. There are things like the parameters, the numbers we use, labs and BMI and things like that, that actually weren't developed in response to the people that we're evaluating. And there are also the other pieces of the social dimensions of health that are very rarely part of the questions that we ask in evidence, and very rarely present themselves in evidence as hey, you can decide that this person who has darker skin tone and is sitting in your office for prenatal care is of higher risk, but you absolutely must assess that risk alongside all the social dimensions of health. That is almost never part of public health messaging and is almost never part of the evidence too. And there's a lot of reasons for that we touched upon in class last week. So then think about, who do we trust, right? How is trust developed? Well, a lot of that has to do with where it's coming from, the organizations. We did talk about that, like academia, CDC, WHO. A lot of that has eroded over the last couple of years. And while I find it problematic in that then we can't find any consensus on who we believe or trust, it is also really important to understand that, like, when trust is eroded, we are uncovering something. We don't know what that is yet, right? Who should be the person who speaks, or the people that speak, is yet to be identified. Although there's a lot of conversations that are happening around that. Who should we trust? There's a lot of conversations happening around that we are still not really exploring deeply. But there are questions that we should ask ourselves, like, how do we decide how we trust people? Because they've presented themselves in authority, because they look like me, or both, or none of the above, because I trust people who are anti those people. I'm not necessarily asking for the right answer when I ask you to ask those questions of yourselves, but for you to get really clear on how do you build trust, because that's going to be a really important part of understanding. If 75% of the people in the public build trust through relationship, and we're presenting data, then we've missed 75% of the people in public health messaging. And that's a very important piece for those of you who are planning on health studies, media communications, business. Understanding what makes people tick is a really important part of all of your fields of expertise, right? How do people make buying decisions, right? How do people make media consumption decisions? How do people decide to interact with ads? How do people decide to make life decisions? Those are all really important pieces of any arena that some of you may be going into, whether it's medicine, psychology, business, media communications. So understanding specifically how people interact with trust, what elements are included and specifically what elements are excluded, is a really important part of all of the fields you'll eventually find yourselves in, personally and professionally. Evaluating the validity and utility of that information. We talked a little bit about that last week too, but I think that this is the part that is very challenging, right? And has been a really big source of conversation the last couple of years. Like, well, how do you know that's true? Why do you believe that? Are you just a sheep? Are you, are you not discerning? Are you not asking the right questions? Are you not, enough? Are you not anti-establishment enough? And all of those are legitimate questions and concerns, right? Because if our systems are feeding us information that are ultimately not representing the way a lot of us operate, and honestly, the way a lot of us, who a lot of us are, then we shouldn't really trust them. But there are ways that public health data does at least endeavor to, and I think that a lot of times does try to stack layers of credibility that is distinct from the way that other healthcare information is not disseminated. So when you are looking at stuff that is posted or circulated and or through social media purposes, if you're not looking at the citations, if you're not looking at the data that is the basis for that, say, infographic or that meme or whatever it is, you may not be understanding the layers that are underneath it. There may be no layers. And I think that when we talk about credibility and trust, ultimately it's about layers or it's about reps. It's the same thing we talked about. Like, if you want to build muscle, you got to do reps. You got to use that muscle, and not just once, not just really intensely 3 times, but you have to use it frequently and intensely, both, right? So if we only have an intense relationship with our muscle, or we only have a frequency relationship, we will also build different kinds of strength, different layers of strength. But we can build the most strength if we have a diverse relationship with that muscle, both intensity and strength, and reps, right? And frequency. So the same is also true about data and trust and building layers there, and credibility. That one of the ways that you can build credibility is very much the same way. So really intense collections of data, like sort of like big studies of like 10, 20,000 people, but also some of the smaller things, some of the more qualitative things like surveys and interviews, where they might only interview 60 people, which might seem significant, but from a statistical perspective or population perspective, 60 people are not going to speak for 350 million Americans. But when you create those layers of like, here's a study that says, that looked at 20,000 people, but only with a couple of questions. But when we asked deeper questions and we did case studies and focus groups and observational studies and interviews, we got a lot of the same information out of those types of inquiry as well. And so I think that this is the other piece that I want to toss out in follow-up to our conversation that we started last week on evidence is, if you are looking at information, don't just look at the information in the citation, look for the reps, look for the layers. And that is honestly going to contribute a lot more to the credibility, because it actually means that we have probably asked this question a bunch of different ways to a lot of different kinds of people in a lot of different arenas. And that is going to mean more when we're talking about a population or a public strategy, and distinguish that from an individual or personal strategy. So these are all the questions to ask when we're thinking about like health communication. So this is when you consume health communication, but when also you deliver it. You want to be really cognizant of like, okay, there's data collected, but like, where was it collected? So all those layers we're talking about, and what, right? So the reps. How was that information compiled, right? So the diversity. So not just the number of times that it was done, but the diversity or the intensity with which it was done. How was it presented too, right? Because if we only present in one arena, like say we only present through Instagram, we're going to miss huge swaths of people who may not consume social media at all, who might be of different generations, who might have different languages that they are not able to interact with those social media forms in, who may not read at all. And need to actually receive their information visually through pictographs or infographics, and or who may have to receive it audially. So we have to think about like, and it's, these are all the same concepts we use in education too, right? Like, part of why we create videos with slides and audio and video, so that people can interact in a myriad of different ways and caption it. The other thing we have to also ask too, and these are the second set of questions, is, what are the other influences? This is where we tie it into sort of social dimensions of health too. When we perceive information, is it, so for instance, public health information that's associated with a risk group or a particular group? Well, if I'm not part of that group, I don't have anything to do with that, right? So we talked a little about that last week too. What is the probability? Well, I mean, that maternal mortality morbidity is only related to Black women, so not for me. I'm not concerned, and it's very unlikely, except that we're not really examining the underlying causes there in that bit of public health data, right? And this is again where we go into social dimensions of health. It's like, well, if the probability is only associated with skin color and not necessarily with poverty, systemic discrepancies, housing issues, transportation issues, healthcare access issues, then we haven't actually figured out that actually a lot of people who have all those other dimensions of health, but don't have this one particular quality, physical quality, might actually experience all the same negative health consequences. And then a big one is values, right? We saw this full-fledged during the course of the pandemic, is that really the way a lot of people make health decisions is based on their personal values. Whether or not they felt that they should be concerned about other people's health, whether or not they should be concerned about how health information is communicated, whether or not they felt that that they should be concerned about particular groups of people, like, oh, okay, well, I see that this virus is causing higher rates of death and hospitalization in people who are 85. Well, I don't know anybody who's over 85, and I'm not over 85, so I don't care. And that's a probability thing, but it's also a values thing, right? That we don't necessarily have a lot of value in our culture for older people, period, regardless whether they're connected to us or not. Other things might be, well, I don't actually have a lot of value for, I'm just here for me and mine. I don't take care of other people. There's a lot of people who had those viewpoints as well, that it's not my responsibility to take care of other people. It's just my responsibility to care for myself. And that's my only job. And that was very often how people make health decisions. And really, truly speaking, it's the way a lot of people did even pre-pandemic. I mean, having been in healthcare and public health for almost 25 years, I can tell you that one of the most pivotal features of how people make health decisions is their personal values. Well, I don't like putting substances that that don't come from the ground into my body, so I'm not going to do it. I don't like, it's not even about whether there might actually be like terrible information, like really very clearly harmful information about the decision they're making, but their values trump the data. So I think that, when we talk about health communication, when we talk about even the larger piece of social dimensions of health, one of the things that has to figure into this is like, not just all the social parameters of what affects people's health, but also how they contribute to their, all the social dimensions of like values too, right? And how people actually interact with healthcare decision making based on their own personal values as one of the dimensions of health. Other pieces of this are some personality traits, potentially. We can think of it this way. Are people more risk averse? Are people more risk tolerant? I am a more risk tolerant person personally. It's not just that I have a lot of healthcare information and ability to also discern information and resources, in terms of my colleagues, in terms of the healthcare system, but it's also that I'm more risk tolerant. So I'm willing to let something go for a little bit longer, whatever that means, to see how it plays out. Because I have received the feedback from my own personal experience that like, I can handle some stuff, right? Like things don't necessarily knock me down as easily as they might another person. I haven't died yet. And so it makes me feel affirmed that this other thing is also going to follow suit. And that is honestly the way a lot of people also make decisions. That is different than values and way different than data. It's maybe you could say personal data, right? Well, my personal data points say I'm living. So far, what hasn't killed me has, well, if not made me stronger, at least not killed me. And we might make decisions that way too. And honestly, a lot of people do. I've also seen many people in my practice over the years who are more risk averse. They have a lot more health anxiety and they're like, I never want to be sick. I never want to suffer. So if there's anything I can do, I never want my children to suffer. That's a really big one, especially having seen people during pregnancy, newborn stage, parenting is one of the major transformative experiences for health in general, for the whole family, is the birth of a child, or the impending or following the birth of a child. Is that like, oh, I'm responsible for the nurturance of this human. I better make sure my plate, like what's on my plate, looks a little better because that kid's going to eat off my plate at some point. Things like that. There's this other piece here that I want to introduce to you, and we'll get more into it later on in the course of this quarter, probably later on, a few weeks out. But there's the concepts of informed decision making, informed consent, and shared decision making. And these are dimensions of health, but aren't necessarily social dimensions of health. But on some level they are too, because they can play into healthcare access, healthcare providers, education, values, culture, and it is a little bit more complex than the online definitions will make them out to be. So I just want to say a couple of things about them. Informed decision making is the idea that I give you some information about, say, gestational diabetes, and I say, this many people will be diagnosed with gestational diabetes, and this many people who are diagnosed with gestational diabetes will have complications. And here are the complications, and here's the number of people that have those complications, who they are. So very often informed decision-making utilizes public health data, evidence that is generated from research. And so we've talked about, where does that come from? Who creates it? What are the underlying reasons we create that data? Is also because of populations of, who experience disparities or inequities in healthcare too. So it's interesting that very often informed decision-making is also based on kind of deficit healthcare data. The idea that there are certain people in our population who have a higher propensity to death and or health complications. And we use that data to inform everyone's decision-making. And if they see themselves in that data, they may decide, well, I'm not that person, so I feel safer with this decision or this course of action. Where social dimensions of health ties into this is, well, but we haven't provided the nuances. Like, yeah, but if you're also experiencing lack of healthcare access, poverty, lack of education, you could have the same outcomes. That is the distinction, excuse me, between informed decision-making and shared decision-making. Shared decision-making is the idea that not only are we using data points that we typically derive from populations who experience inequities and disparities, but we are also using the circumstances of that person and applying the data to their situation. So we are layering, creating reps, creating credibility, right? In that, for that person, of like, how does this data apply to me? And those are the two, that is the major distinction when we talk about shared decision making. The other distinction, and that kind of ties to informed consent, is that in shared decision making versus informed is I'm the provider, instructor, whatever, I give you information and there's a power dynamic. Shared decision making is we are on the level. You as the person receiving the information, with experiencing the thing, whether it's pregnancy, gestational diabetes, cancer, you are on the same level as me, and you are the expert in you. I am providing the data that I have at my fingertips, and we are putting that together in partnership. And that's a very different healthcare experience, healthcare outcomes, and engagement from the healthcare provider standpoint. Very often people are interacted with in a healthcare setting through informed decision-making and not shared decision-making. And I bring this up because tying into social dimensions of health is a key element of shared decision-making. And when that is not considered in decision-making, it is then not shared decision-making. Even if your provider says to you, we're partners in this, but then continues to rattle off information. Your provider says that to you. So if your provider says, okay, now you tell me about your life, and then we are going to take this data and plug it in there, that's the beginning of a shared decision-making process. Informed consent is the idea that when you've received your information to make your decision, you then give your consent. Informed consent can happen both in response to informed decision-making or shared decision-making. But the idea is that you have received all the information that you need. So then a question that I ask rhetorically is, can you give informed consent if you have not engaged in shared decision-making? Can you truly make an informed choice about your healthcare if the data points, the public health information, the evidence, the research has not been plugged into your healthcare experience and your expertise in you, because no one else has been you except for you. No one else has had your chronic condition in your body except for you. I have an answer to that, but I ask that to you and want you to think about that a little bit for yourselves, for people you might interact with in other healthcare settings, but also even just for your family members. And then always what comes into these conversations, and which ties directly to social dimensions of health again, is who has the knowledge and the power. If you have less knowledge and there is a person sharing their knowledge, there is a power dynamic, always. And there are a few ways that you can neutralize or at least level the power dynamic. And a huge part of that is bringing you to that scenario. And always remembering that you always have the most amount of knowledge in you. And you always, technically, if you wanted, have the most power in understanding and advocating for you. But it is easier said than done. And we'll get to the social dimensions of health part of that in the next video.